Mike will fuck
Hey,
with me.
hey, hey, nah, nah, nah. Tell me what you think we hustle for. I just wanna battle world. Do the impossible. Sing it with me, nah, 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 nah. What you think we out here working for?
Rich gang.
The World History course begins with the Neolithic Revolution. Early hominids, known as Homo sapiens, were the beginning of mankind and were the first species to consciously think for themselves. This separated them from most other species and began world history. Paleolithic culture consisted of small nomadic bands and settled only where there was plentiful supplies of food. The settled societies began to create their own type of culture, and we see the beginnings of cave art and even some trade with other groups. These permanently stationed towns needed a food source, and we see the start of agriculture begin to take hold. The domestication of plants and animals begins in Southwest Asia, seen as early as 9000 BCE. The shift to agriculture becomes the catalyst for the population spike in 5000 BCE, where we see the human population jump to around 5 million people. As the people begin to grow, advancements in civilization began. Towns began to have walls, and specialized labor forces and classes form to create things like pottery and textiles. In Mesopotamia, we see the earliest cities form. The population, once again, begins to spike, specifically in Sumer, as a result of the use of irrigation from 6000 to 5000 BCE. 4000 BCE shows evidence of religious beliefs due to the formation of ziggurats. Empires begin to form and are ruled by people such as Hammurabi and Sargon of Akkad. Hammurabi's kingdom also shows the first signs of law through Hammurabi's Code. In the Assyrian kingdom, technologies begin to advance through the use of horse-drawn chariots and iron weapons. Bronze begins to get used too, and transportation breakthroughs occur with the wheel and the start of shipbuilding, which was primarily done by the Sumerians.
Okay, so starting with the Persian empires. Big picture, they establish a precedent for how to govern large empires. And the first Persian empire was the Achaemenid Empire. And that was followed by Alexander the Great, who conquered the Achaemenid. And he also conquered Greece and marched east and created a huge empire before he died mysteriously. And after his death, his empire was split up into three empires: the Seleucid, the Ptolemaic, and the Antigonid. And then following that, there was the Parthian and the Sassanid for the other Persian empires. The Ptolemaic and Antigonid were not Persian. And also, big picture, the Persians created things called qanats, which were a way of getting underground water up to places that were normally dry, and that was incredible engineering at the time. And also for religion, they practiced Zoroastrianism, which involved an omnipotent God fighting evil, and the belief was that good would ultimately triumph over evil, and that had a big influence on future religions, and Christianity was a big example of that. Okay, next we have the Greek civilizations. The earliest Greek civilization was the Minoan civilization, and what's notable about them is they spoke a language called Linear A, which has not yet been deciphered. And they were then followed by the Mycenaean civilization, who was then followed by the Polis in mainland Greece, and the two major polis, which are city-states, were Sparta and Athens. Sparta was known for their military, and every man was a soldier, and Athens was known for their democracy, where every landowning man could participate in government. So the Persian Wars were a war where the Greeks fought off the Persians, and that was then followed by the Peloponnesian Wars, where Sparta defeated Athens. And because they were sort of the city-states were divided on the Peloponnesian War, Alexander the Great's father, Philip II, was able to come in and conquer Greece and then give the empire over after he died to his son Alexander the Great. And then after that, the Antigonid Empire happened after Alexander's death. And basically, big picture for the Greek civilizations were there were huge amounts of trade and there were huge cultural leaps, sort of notable teachings by Socrates, Plato, and then Aristotle in that order. And for religion, they practiced polytheism.
Unit 3. Unit 3 starts in Islam, where we see the Kaaba, a cube-like shrine at Mecca. This shrine was prayed to every day by the Islamic citizens. During this time, there was the introduction of one God, with Muhammad as a prophet. Societal-wise, there was a power struggle in Islam between the Sunnis and Shias. The Sunnis accepted early caliphs, while the Shias wanted Ali and his descendants. Next, the Anatolia and Lower Danube regions were explored. This region was considered to be the breadbasket of the Byzantine Empire. Within the Byzantine Empire, the creation of the Hagia Sophia helped the city to be rebuilt. The Byzantine Empire came to a decline during the Fourth Crusade. In Africa, Alexandria was the centerpiece of Christianity during this time period. A revolt of East Africans took place from the year 869 to 883 CE. It was called the Zanj Rebellion. Within the Mali Empire, Mansa Musa started his travels, while Africa began trading in the Indian Ocean. Unit 3, China focused on the Sui, Tang, and Song dynasties. During this time period, porcelain played a huge role in trade and luxury within China. In China, Buddhism was introduced alongside Neo-Confucianism. In India at the time, Buddhism began to decline while Hinduism rose to supremacy. In Europe, the Hippodrome was the Greek structure stadium for sporting events and entertainment, such as horse and chariot racing. As well, we see the introduction of Vikings. Important Vikings such as Baharn Harjulfsson paved the way for many conquests across northern Europe. The Vikings would use longboats to cut through the Nordic oceans to conquest different civilizations. In the Oceania region, Unit 3 saw the rise of the Aztecs. Emperors such as the Tenochtitlan ruled over the Aztec men and women. Close to the Aztecs, in South America, the Incas reigned supreme during this time period. Unit 3 saw the rise of Silk Road, allowing for long-distance travel and trade. Silk Road, used by the Mongol Empire, was ruled by the great Genghis Khan, who we know as one of the most notorious leaders in all of history. That concludes Unit 3.
Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta were two of the most important names in the Unit 3 when it comes to the topic of cross-cultural interaction. In this time, there was an increase in travel and interaction. The Mongols and other empires made the Silk Road safe to travel on. This allowed the spread of culture, but also diseases. When Western Europeans got to be more of a part of this exchange, they went west looking to reach Asia, and brought the Western Hemisphere into this exchange. This created a global interdependence that will be talked about in the next unit. Trade was one of the largest motivations to go west. Bulkier commodities still took to the ocean, though. Trading cities grew, stretching from Khanbalik to Timbuktu. Malacca is an example of one of these cities. Marco Polo was known as the Merchant of Venice. It was Marco Polo's interest in the Far East that led Columbus to sail west. Marco Polo's initial trip to China was mercantile, but after that they were far more diplomatic. A Mongol-Christian alliance against Islam was attempted, but fell through, of course, when the Mongol leader converted to Islam. Ibn Battuta's travels also fit into the political side of this spectrum. Ibn Battuta was a judge in a number of places as he traveled through Dar al-Islam. Another reason to travel along the Silk Roads was missionary activity. With missionary exchange came cross-cultural interaction. Cultures, religions, science, crops, weaponry, and languages were shared and fused into new ones. The compass was an example of science that was shared, of course, from the east to the west. The bubonic plague began in China's Hubei province and was spread by fleas and rodents. Obviously, it then spread to Europe and became the monster that we all know in the 14th and 15th centuries. It took a large toll on the population of countries in Europe, economy, and society. Labor shortages began and urban workers could demand higher wages. Because of the bubonic plague, the Mongols departed China in the 14th century. The Ming dynasty took over after the Mongols departed. They wanted to reassert their Confucian Chinese values, have a strict central authority, and create a self-sufficient economy. They planned to do this by rebuilding irrigation systems and promoting internal manufacturing. The Holy Roman Empire did not really lend itself to state building in Europe after the Black Death. The 100 Years' War deterred rebuilding. Joan of Arc was an icon in the 100 Years' War. The Mongols in Russia also got in the way of state building. In Russia, state building came from Moscow. Ivan the Great created a centralized government model on the Byzantine Empire. From then on, Moscow was known as the Third Rome.
At this point in world history, the European nations began their various renaissances, the first of which was the exploration renaissance. Oceanic exploration led to new developments in nautical technologies as well. The magnetic compass, the astrolabe, stern-post rudder, and lateen sails are a few examples. Some of the more famous voyages include Columbus's finding of America, Vasco da Gama's establishment of a Portuguese trade port in India, Magellan's circumnavigation, and James Cook's oceanic voyage. The establishment of these trading post empires connected England, Spain, the Dutch, and the Portuguese to India, Indonesia, Java, and the Philippines respectively. With new trade empires, American crops, goods, diseases, and slaves flew from east to west. Religious reformations also took place during this time. The notable ones include the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Reformation. Martin Luther, the driving force behind the Protestant Reformation, found evil in the selling of indulgences and inspired John Calvin to create the Calvinistic faith. In addition to inspiring the creation of Calvinism, Martin Luther caused the Catholic Church to reform as well. Witch hunts and the 30 Years' War, which was fought because of the Catholic and Protestant Reformations, occurred during the same time as well. Unit 5 begins with various revolutions of the world. The American Revolution, which was started because the Americans wanted fewer taxes and complete independence from Great Britain, started off this trend. In France, a revolution that resulted in the upheaval of the monarchy, an establishment of a republic, and then ended in a dictatorship led by Napoleon, had lasting effects in Europe and inspired several other revolutions as well. The Haitian Revolution, which was the only successful slave uprising during this time, was one of the few Latin American revolutions that occurred following the both American and French revolutions. Some of the others include the Mexican Revolution, Simón Bolívar's various revolutions, and Brazil's revolution. Industrialization of the world began to happen in Unit 5. Increased efficiency in agriculture, transportation, economies, and new fuel sources all contributed to the rise of the industrial world. As captains of industry such as Eli Whitney, Sam Slater, and Henry Ford began to mass-produce goods, urbanization, the development of cities, and increased standards of living occurred across the world. While the captains of industry grew capitalism in the West, socialism and communism grew in the East. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels developed Marxism in the Communist Manifesto and stated that if capitalism grew, there would be an inevitable fight between the proletariat and aristocracy. The nations of the West developed and grew within their independence. The United States expanded west through Manifest Destiny. Canada, by way of the Durham Report and George Lambert, also grew independently as well. In Latin America, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Colombia became autocratic governments and no longer owed loyalty to a singular Gran Colombia. The Creole aristocracy, however, still ruled the regions. Argentina, led by Caudillo Juan Manuel de Rosas, grew as well. Once the United States and others developed in the Western Hemisphere, imperialism became a global trend. The U.S., who felt a strong degree of the white man's burden, began to assert dominance in Panama and other Latin American countries. On the European front, Great Britain, who lusted after Asian goods, controlled India. In addition, many other European countries held some form of trade state or colony in Southeast Asia. France, French Indonesia, England, again Burma, Malaya, Dutch East Indies, and the Spanish Philippines. At this time in Asia, the Ottoman Empire declined and fell. With no involvement in Atlantic trade, massive debt, and little hold over the extraneous regions of the empire, the Ottoman Empire was no more. In China, the Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, and the Boxer Rebellion brought about massive changes to the Chinese government, people, and faiths. The Opium Wars were fought between Britain and China over diplomacy, trade, and treatment of foreign nationals. The Taiping Rebellion was a civil war fought by a man named Hong Xiuquan, who believed he was a brother of Jesus Christ, against the Buddhist, Confucian, and Taoist leaders of China. Xiuquan wanted the implementation of a new Christian faith in China. A secret society known as the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, aka the Boxers, also led a rebellion in China. The Boxer Rebellion was fought because the Boxers did not like foreign influences and foreign imperialism in China.
Unit 4 and 5, Major Movements and Styles of Government by Bray O'Connor. Absolute monarchy, an undemocratic monarchy that transfers powers to the monarch who acts as a dictator of head of state. It was initiated due to the Holy Wars and the decline of the church. Also, constitutional monarchy, a liberal monarchy that gives limited powers to the monarch as in the monarchy of England. The Prime Minister of the state holds the maximum powers and political effectiveness. It was initiated when the monarchs emerged as irresponsible and careless leaders. Remember the Magna Carta? How? Well, it transferred the absolute monarchy into constitutional monarchy in England. Syncretism, the fusion of cultural elements from one or more tradition. In colonial Latin America, religious syncretism was common, with both Amerindians and Africans blending their existing beliefs and rituals with Catholicism. Coexist, gentlemen. Casta system, a complex racial hierarchy devised in Spanish America to describe the dozens of possible outcomes of mixtures between Europeans, Amerindians, and Africans, mestizo, mulatto, métis, etc. Communities, self-governing communities of escaped slaves common in the early modern Caribbean and coastal areas of Central and South America. Enlightenment, European philosophical movement of the late 17th and 18th centuries that stressed the use of reason over the authority of the ancient philosophers or religious leaders in descriptions of society and the natural world. Enlightenment despots, 18th century European rulers who sought to systematically apply Enlightenment ideals to the administration of the government. Caudillos, Latin American military men who gained power through violence during the early 19th and 20th centuries. An example would be Santa Anna. Remember the Alamo, boys? Tanzimat reforms, 1839 to 1876, reconstruction of the Ottoman Empire. Control over civil laws was taken away from religious authorities, while military and government bureaucracies were reorganized to gain efficiency. Self-strengthening movement, 19th century Chinese reform movement with the mottos Confucian ethics and Western science. Advocates of the movement helped to find ways to reconcile Western and Chinese systems of thought. Meiji Restoration, 1868, a dramatic revolution in Japan that overthrew the Tokugawa, restored national authority to the emperor, and put the country in a path of political and economic reform under the slogans Revere the Emperor and Expel the Barbarians. Meiji industrialization turned Japan into a major world power. Responsible government, 19th century constitutional arrangement in North America that allowed colonies to achieve dominion status within the British Empire and elect parliaments responsible for internal affairs. The British appointed governors as their sovereign's representative and retained control of foreign policy. Confederation of Canada, 1867, Confederation of former British colonies under a single federal constitution, reorganized under the British North America Act. The Confederation was a dominion within the British Empire. New imperialism, an increase in the European imperial activity during the late 19th century caused primarily by increased competition between the industrial states for raw materials and markets by the rise of unified Germany as a threat to the British Empire. Union of South Africa, self-governing dominion within the British Empire created in 1910 from a number of British colonies and Boer republics of the South American War. This compromise protected British mining and Boer agriculture at the expense of American interests. Federation of Indochina, 1897. Federation created by the French after having conquered Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Was an administrative convenience as societies that made up the Federation had little in common. Weimar Republic, 1919 to 1933. After the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Weimar Republic created a new Germany based on a liberal constitution. However, the new republic was faced with huge war debts, political turmoil, and rising inflation. Mandate system by which former Ottoman provinces and German colonies were redistributed. Based on the idea that some societies were not ready for national self-determination, it expanded the empires of Britain, France, Belgium, and Japan while angering African, Arab, and Chinese nationalists. Thank you from Volume 4 and 5 of Bray O'Connor's World History Dictionary, Subsection 3, Major Movements and Styles of Government.
World War I, which was known as the Great War, was caused when an Austrian Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, is assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. For the most part, everyone saw this war coming, and most of the powers that were, in part, had built up their armies over the years, and they were able to utilize this when the war culminated. So basically, Austria-Hungary, which is allied with Germany, attacks Serbia, who's allied with Russia, and Russia mobilizes their troops on the Serbian border. So ipso facto, attacking one country declares war on all of its allies. During World War I, they utilized trench warfare, which is kind of to combat the machine gun, which changed the style of battle. And these trenches that were dug out were horrific. The conditions, there were rats and other rodents, and they were huge hotspots for disease. And another kind of new technology, well, two of them that were utilized during this war were the elements of mustard gas, kind of added some chemical warfare, and then U-boats changed the naval front. And World War I was considered to be the first true total war, which means that there was a lot of fighting, and this is the first war that kind of had the element of a home front, which means like a lot of people back at home. War was considered a nationwide event, and people had to contribute to the war efforts. Even civilians that weren't fighting, like conserving food would be an example. And then an interesting kind of thing that happened during this time was that women moved into the workforce because they had to occupy some of the jobs that were left behind from men that were drafted into the war. And post-war, this kind of leads to women's suffrage. And another kind of element is the war bonds, which helped to finance the war efforts. Then over the course of the 20th century, many countries began to challenge the Eurocentric reign of power, a reign that also included the United States. This brought about two major world conflicts, obviously World War I and World War II, and the world's landscape began to change as land-based empires began to fall, one example being the Qing Empire and the Ottoman and Old Russian empires collapsed due to a variety of factors, one being technological stagnation. And some colonies began to negotiate their independence. An example of this being British in India, as India became independent from Britain. And some go about this less peacefully, as Algeria fights for its independence from France. People began to challenge imperial rule, one example being Ho Chi Minh. Transnational movements tried to unite people over land boundaries, an example being communism, which was definitely prevalent during the century. These shifts lead to a lot of ethnic violence, one example being the very obvious, the Holocaust. And people were displaced in large numbers, such as the Palestinians. Nations employed nationalism in order to unite their homeland during a century stricken by two total wars and many more conflicts. It was known as a century of nationalism. And an obvious example of this was the draft, which sought to bolster the army by providing mandatory enlistment for fighters from the nation. There was also a huge shift in power following World War II, which evolved into the nuclear arms race and the Cold War. So the U.S. and the USSR are world superpowers for most of the latter half of this century. NATO and the Warsaw Pact come about after the Cold War conflict. While this is a period of conflict and rest, there were still very peaceful movements during this time, such as those from Gandhi and Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. New World Order and the MIC, which is the military-industrial complex, are two examples of responses to conflicts that actually further intensified them, which kind of provided more weaponry, and there's a lot more technology to use in war, like the atomic bombs and other examples in the following century. And these conflicts had a unique effect as they came across in mass media. An example of this would be the popular James Bond series.
In Unit 6, we learned a lot about the rapid advances in technology. New technology led to rapid advances in the sciences. as well as new modes of transportation, which eliminated geographic distance, as we were able to travel farther and faster, as well as communicate easier. And then it also transformed how we understood the world as new theories began to develop, such as the theory of relativity and the Big Bang Theory. And then there was a green revolution, and as well as advances in medicine, such as the artificial heart or the polio vaccine. Outcomes of new technology. On the environment, we exploited a lot of the Earth's finite resources. As well, global warming became a new idea, as we released a lot of greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. This contaminated a lot of our clean water and clean air. As well, there was a lot of deforestation, which led to the extinction of many species of animals. There was also a lot of new diseases that were discovered, diseases that were caused by poverty, such as malaria and tuberculosis, a lot of new epidemics, such as influenza and Ebola, as well as a lot of diseases caused by longevity, such as diabetes and Alzheimer's. There was also a lot of new technology in warfare, such as tanks, the atomic bomb, and airplanes. There was also trench warfare and firebombing. And then because of this new technology, wartime casualties skyrocketed. An example of this would be the bombing of Hiroshima. Political order. Older land-based empires collapsed. This was due to a lot of internal and external factors. One of these being economical hardship. There was also the rise of a lot of new nationalist leaders such as Gandhi. There was also a lot of military conflicts, the two major ones being World War I and World War II. There was also a lot of global conflict, such as imperialist expansion, competition for resources, and ethnic conflict. Outcomes of warfare. There was a lot of economic challenges. Communist countries took a more controlled aspect over their economy, using things such as the 5-year plan. The United States took a more controlled aspect after the Great Depression, using things such as the New Deal. And newly independent states took a very strict aspect over their economy. States became increasingly interdependent. There was a lot of new organizations, such as the League of Nations, as well as a lot of regional trade agreements, such as European unions. And then questioning society. People used new technology to challenge old assumptions. There was also a lot of human rights movements, such as the women's right movement. And there was a lot of increased diversity, which caused a lot of things, one of those things being race riots. As well, there was new forms of spirituality and politics, such as liberation theology.
Right after the end of World War II, the Cold War began. Two pacts were formed almost instantly, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan were two efforts by the United States to contain communism in Eastern Europe. The Marshall Plan involved $120 billion to help rebuild struggling European economies, but to also prevent communism from spreading to these areas. The Truman Doctrine was issued in 1947 and stated that the United States would provide political, financial, and military assistance to any democratic nation under threat from somebody. This was also to prevent a communist takeover of a democratic country and to once again contain communism. In 1948, West Berlin was closed off and ground transportation was prohibited, so the Berlin airlift took place. Western European countries, as well as the United States, airlifted much-needed supplies into West Berlin to keep the people alive. The democratic West Berlin was favored to the communist East Berlin, so many people escaped from East to West Berlin. In 1961, this problem was dealt with through the construction of the Berlin Wall. It was later destroyed in 1989. There was much conflict in Europe, where it all began. However, the Cold War had a strong presence in every corner of the globe. In Cuba, the Bay of Pigs took place in 1961, a failed military takeover of Cuba headed by the CIA-supported military group Brigade 2506. Then, in 1962, the infamous Cuban Missile Crisis took place, where Cuba housed Soviet ballistic missiles. After a 2-week confrontation, Soviet Union withdrew its missiles from Cuba. Scary times for the United States. Another example was Vietnam. After World War II, the U.S. supported the French takeover of Vietnam, however it failed. The Geneva Conference then took place, in which the parties agreed to a division between a communist North Vietnam and a democratic South Vietnam. Elections were also supposed to take place to determine the leader of the whole country. However, it never happened, for South Vietnam feared that Ho Chi Minh would win. This led to the Vietnam War, which was one of the longest wars in history. Another conflict was in the People's Republic of China. The new leader, Mao Zedong, introduced the Great Leap Forward. This was a 5-year plan intended on making China an industrial world power and to catch up to other countries. It ended in epic failure, however, and led to famine that may have killed as many as 20 million people. Looking ahead, in 1989, the Tiananmen protests took place. This was a pro-democracy movement which was quickly wiped out through the use of military tanks. Around this time was when the Cold War began to come to an end. Détente, an easing of tension between two countries, took place between the USA and Russia. SALT, strategic arms limitation talks, also occurred and called for more armament control.
Mike will hey, nah, nah, nah. Tell me what you think we hustle for.